Hello and welcome to this DecisionWise webinar. My name's Charles Rogel and I'm the Vice President of Consulting Services here at DecisionWise and also your host. The title of this presentation is Employee Engagement Best Practices for 2022. Our presenter today is Dave Long, Chief Operating Officer here at DecisionWise. All right, Dave, with all that out of the way, let me turn the time over to you.
Okay. Today we're here to talk about employee engagement, things that we've learned over the last year and as we get ready for 2022. How we're going to be approaching engagement in the future. Of course, some of these principles that we're going to be covering today are pretty timeless, but others are things that as we learn more and more about engagement, work with more and more organizations, we start to understand better how the best organizations, as they use best practices to improve, how they really approach employee engagement. So we'll be talking a lot about that today. The agenda today, we're going to go through some important definitions, defining what we mean by employee engagement, some other terms that we may use as we go through this presentation. We've brought some data from our 2021 database and really trying to pull some insights from that data. Really interesting things that we found over the last year. The numbers from the last year have been quite different than benchmarks that we've seen in the past. And so we'll be really, I think it's going to be really interesting to talk about some of the things that we have seen over the last year. One of the things that I really want to address today is shifting our focus as we think about measuring and addressing engagement from outcomes to process. Now, we always measure outcomes when we are measuring for engagement, but we want to really focus on how do we improve the process in order to get better outcomes. And so part of that will be setting better expectations for leadership and employing a more effective listening campaign. And we'll also talking about managing the employee experience, both the things that we plan for and the things that come up in the employee experience that we don't plan for. So that's the agenda for today. Hopefully, we'll try to keep this as interesting as possible as we go through this. I wanted to start out with just, again, some definitions that we want to use and that we may use as we go through this presentation. Satisfaction is a term that we used very early on when measuring the level of employee experience we had with our employees. We called it satisfaction. And satisfaction, how we define it today, is really the transactional or contractual part of the employer-employee relationship. So when we think about satisfaction, we're thinking about things like am I paid enough? Do I have the right benefits? Do I have a safe work environment? Do I have the tools I need to do my job or the training that I need to do my job? All those things are critical parts of the employee experience and things that people would expect to be part of a job when they took the job. When I take a job, I expect that I'm going to have all those things provided for me. When we look to move beyond satisfaction to what we call engagement, to more of a transformational state, we're looking to engage people at all levels. We're looking to have them bring more of themselves, more of their talents, more of their thoughts and opinions and ideas. And we're looking to bring more of their time and their effort into their job every day. Then we need to connect with them at a deeper level than I'm really happy I have the tools that I need to do my job. We need to connect with them at a deeper level. And it turns out, as we work to connect with people at a deeper level, a lot of those things that do connect at a deeper level are contained within this acronym MAGIC. So I'll go through all 5 of these here up front just so you can kind of understand. When we're measuring for engagement and engagement outcomes, these are the things that we're really looking for. We're looking for meaning in the work. So an employee has purpose, that what's important to them is important to the organization that they work for, and they get to fulfill some of their personal purpose through the work that they do at the organization. We look for autonomy, that they feel trusted by the organization, that they feel trusted by their managers, or that they can do their work without constant micromanagement or oversight. We look for growth, that an employee feels like they're making progress both personally and professionally through the work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis and over time. Impact, that they feel valued for the contribution that they make within the organization and even recognized for that contribution, that they can recognize that they're making a contribution to the success of the organization. All those things fit into the category we call impact. And the last thing is connection, that they feel like they belong here, they feel included in the organization, they feel like they have people that they can rely upon, that they care about and that they can trust. So all these 5 factors are things that if I have these in place, they're things that allow me to connect with the organization and the work I do at a deeper level and can lead me to be more engaged in the work. And that's great. We really need to understand what are some of these components, but really what we're doing is when we're working in the practical world of trying to improve engagement in an organization, we need to really understand where are we, when we action plan, when we try to actually improve engagement, where do we need to do that? Where do we need to focus our efforts? So we'll be talking about that today. Before we get too far into this, I wanted to give a couple of more definitions here because we just talked about employee engagement. I mentioned what that was. But sometimes when we are talking to clients, they'll kind of conflate a few words together: culture, employee experience, employee engagement. And sometimes when people use our survey products, they'll call them culture surveys or employee experience surveys. Well, there's a difference between culture, employee experience, and engagement, but they're all related. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit today. First of all, if we were kind of to give a by-the-book definition of culture, we would say it's a set of values, norms, guiding beliefs, and understandings that is shared by members of an organization and is taught to new members as the way to feel, think, and behave. Another way, or a simpler definition for culture that I've heard often, is culture is simply the way we do things around here. It's a way that I like to think about culture because when we start thinking about how do we impact the things that culture touches, we start thinking about, well, how do we impact the way we do things around here? Can we change the way we do things around here in order to get better outcomes in the organization? So then beyond culture, we have employee experience. It's the sum of perceptions employees have about their interactions with the organization in which they work. In other words, employee experience is the impact of the culture on the employees, specifically on the employees. Of course, culture has impact on customers and all sorts of places, but specifically when we talk about employee experience, we're talking about the impact that culture has on employees. And then engagement is the emotional state that we talked about before, where people feel more passionate, energetic, and committed to their work. And as a result, they're more likely to bring more of themselves or their best selves into the work that they do. And that employee engagement you might consider to be the employees, and we'll say positive emotional response, right? Not just emotional response to the employee experience, because it can be negative, but their positive emotional response to the employee experience. So to sum that all up, engagement, employee engagement, we're trying for, what we're solving for here, is an outcome of employee experience, and employee experience is an outcome of organizational culture. Employee experience is an outcome of the way we do things around here. And therefore, so is the level of engagement. It's an outcome of the way we do things around here. So improving engagement will usually require improving employee experience, which will likely require adjustments to the way we do things around here, or organizational culture. So with all of that in mind, and kind of where we're working and understanding sort of the difference between those three things, I do want to look back at 2021 and some of the things that we've noticed over the last year. And of course, 2021 is the year following 2022 or 2020, which was not exactly a fun year for most people. But it's really interesting to see how perceptions in the workplace have changed over the last year. So we're going to look at that today. And one of the things that I want to do is just say, where are the biggest changes? One thing that I'll note up front, hardly anything got less favorable in our benchmark. So almost everything got more favorable or stayed the same in our benchmark from 2021 to previous years. Mm-hmm. However,
and our benchmark's a 4-year rolling.
Yeah, it's a 4-year rolling benchmark. So we're going to compare 2021's number up to date, right? Mm-hmm. We're December 15th.
Yep.
So up to date, 2021's numbers, we are going to compare that to what we've seen in the past, the 4-year rolling benchmark that we typically use.
Okay.
So hardly anything went, in terms of perceptions, hardly anything went down in 2021. The only thing that did was a question about work-life balance. And that was negatively impacted by 5 or 6 points. Mm-hmm. But then there are a lot of things that actually the perceptions improved over the last year. So the biggest improvement, or the single biggest improvement in the benchmark, was this item about senior leaders. Senior leaders are visible and accessible. The favorable response, in other words, we use a 5-point agreement scale. 77% of responses said agree or strongly agree to this in our benchmark in 2021, this year. Mm-hmm. And that was up 15 points from the previous benchmark.
Which is really surprising.
It's shocking. It's shocking. Like if we had one company that was up 15 points, we would have been surprised by that.
Right, yeah.
One small company, it would take like a 50-person company in a normal year to say, wow, that's a huge difference. Beyond that, we also have another item which deals with senior leaders, which is senior leaders know what is going on in the organization. And that was at 68% favorable. That's not that great of a number, but it was up 8 points from the previous benchmark. And this is a question we use with almost every organization that we work with, but it was up 8 points from the previous benchmark in 2021. So this idea that senior leaders are visible and have a clearer understanding of what's going on in the organization is much more favorable in 2021 than it has been when we've seen it in the past.
And it also kind of indicates that visibility impacts people's perception of their awareness.
I think that's 100% true. That's what I've seen, right? And Charles, you've seen it too. But yeah, I think that's 100% true. The more visible senior leaders are to the people that work in the organization, the more the perception increases that they feel like these folks know what's going on in the organization. The next one is also interesting. Employee voice scores were elevated. And we ask 3 questions on our survey typically about employee voice. One is, am I willing to speak up? The next one would be, if I do speak up, does the organization listen and respond to it or have effective methods for doing that? So that item about the organization having effective methods for receiving and responding to suggestions for change was at 72% in the benchmark in 2021. That was up 10 points from previous benchmarks. That's an area where organizations typically really struggle. They really have a hard time with receiving and responding to suggestions for change. The next one is whether or not, they receive and respond to it, but do they also value my input, feedback, and suggestions that I give? And so that one was up to 70% favorable. 70% of people strongly agree or agreed. And that was up 8 points from the previous benchmark.
That's really surprising too. Yeah, and to give, a question about the database came up, just to give you some perspective. It is our DecisionWise database. It is measuring all the clients that we work with over the past year, and that 4-year rolling benchmark includes hundreds of organizations, many of which have administered a survey multiple times during that time. So it's very robust. Includes a lot of organizations. I'd say most are U.S.-based, probably 75%, 25% outside the U.S., and a lot of them are also asking additional questions about how they're responding to the pandemic in addition to this.
And we do about 150 to 200 engagement surveys every year.
Yeah.
And I think this year was about that, 150 to 200 surveys. And so that's what we're pulling from in 2021. Okay, the next thing, top-down communication. We're starting to see a theme here, right?
Right.
So communication is coming up a lot. So this organization communicates well with all employees about what is going on. That's our big question that we ask to most organizations. That received a 70% favorable score in 2021. That is 13 points higher in 2021 than it was in the previous benchmark. 13 points higher.
These are all the hard questions.
And they're all the tough ones. Yeah, they're all the tough ones.
Normally score low. Yep.
They had a lot of room to grow, and they're growing. And then the last one that I'm going to share here is cross-functional collaboration. Another one of our greatest hits in terms of the things that everybody struggles with. People feel that other departments are more willing to share information. That was 66% favorable. That was up 11 points. And then they also feel they work more effectively across departments and functions. And that was at 64%, usually our lowest scoring item anywhere.
Right.
And still is pretty much one of our lowest scoring items, but it was up 9 points.
And it's very surprising given that there's been a lot of remote work. And everyone predicted that, if we work remotely, collaboration is going to suffer.
Right. And actually, in some ways, it's improved. So if we look at this, communication is improved in almost every way in 2021.
Yeah.
So senior leaders are more accessible, more visible. We know that organizations are communicating from the top down more effectively. We know that employees are feeling more willing to speak up and more valued for the contribution that they're giving when they do speak up. And we know that we're working more effectively across departments and functions. We're collaborating a little bit better. And all of this despite those challenges that you just mentioned, Charles, that we've had over the last year and a half, which are huge things. And I think we did have a lot of organizations that were nervous about if we go to a remote work model, or we have to have social distancing, even if we're in and we're social distance and we have masks on and everything else, there's a lot of worry about what's going to happen in that situation. And what we've seen is that actually things have improved. And so the question that I have, if most organizations are experiencing better outcomes with communication, what you should be asking yourself, the most important thing that you should be asking yourself is, how have processes changed to access those better outcomes?
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about processes and outcomes and how to measure the two today. But really, I think it's useful to, if you feel like things have been going better, or if you've run a survey in 2021 and have experienced better outcomes, a really good thing to do would be, what are we doing differently? A good question to ask myself would be, what am I doing differently? How are we getting these better outcomes? And how can we preserve that and continue doing that in the future? I think what we've seen, and maybe Charles, you could chime in on this too, but I've seen a lot of the organizations that are experiencing better outcomes are just being more deliberate about communication.
Yeah.
They'll have more frequent company meetings. They have more frequent team meetings. They have more frequent one-on-ones between managers and direct reports. They have to be deliberate about that, because in many cases, they're not co-located anymore.
Right.
They're remote, or the employee's remote, and we have to have a one-on-one. And if we're going to have a conversation on a regular basis, I've got to go out of my way to schedule that. It's not just I pass by their desk and say, how are things going?
And that visibility question was interesting from senior leaders, because maybe that's a direct tie to the amount of video meetings that we've had, because you might have not seen the faces very frequently, but now that you're having a video call set up, you're in their home essentially as you're interacting.
The other day, I had to call into a phone number for a conference call and enter a PIN number, and I thought, what is happening
Right?
here?
What is this?
What is this PIN number that I have to enter to get in? Because I'm so used to, over the last year and a half, I'm like, what is this, 2019?
Yeah, right.
I'm so used to over the last year and a half, just going into a Zoom call or going into a Teams meeting, however it might be, that we access it and we see people right in front of us on a screen, and we're able to have better conversations. So those are the tools that we're using are probably different than they were prior to the pandemic. But I'm also going to say that probably some of the processes that you're using are different as well. So process versus outcome. Let's talk a little bit about that. Engagement surveys are very good at measuring outcomes. And what we do with an engagement survey is we cast a wide net, usually about 50 questions, maybe even a few more or a few less. Mm-hmm. And we're saying, here are all the outcomes that we want from our employee experience. These are all the outcomes. We want engagement. That's one of them. We want people to be more committed to stay here. So we ask about that. We want people to feel like they're communicated to, or that they can communicate. We want people to feel like they have training and tools and growth opportunities and all those things from the magic model that we shared at the very beginning. We want people to have all of those things. And so we put a survey out there and we say, are we getting these outcomes? Mm-hmm. Identifying positive or negative outcomes is useful to understand where an organization should focus its efforts. So now the engagement survey is very good at saying, I'm getting the right outcomes here or the wrong outcomes here. And so now I know where I can focus my attention. Now I know where to dive deeper. We're having problems with communication, or more likely they're not now. Yeah. But maybe they were in the past having problems with communication. Now I can say, okay, let's focus on what I need to do to improve that. And then some outcomes, and sometimes an engagement survey will show outcomes where we're doing pretty well in terms of an outcome, but really we actually have poor process behind them. And sometimes the reverse is true as well. Sometimes we have bad outcomes where we've got good process, right?
Yeah, because we'll see high supervisor scores, and they haven't done any leadership development.
Right.
Yeah, no
it's
effort.
Just by the charisma of your leaders, right? You're doing well in that area, right? Yeah. Just sort of lucky. But I would say that generally when we see inconsistent outcomes, meaning if I go from one department to the next and I'm getting different outcomes, it usually means I have some level of inconsistent process. In other words, some people feel like they're getting regular feedback from their manager and that it's great. Mm-hmm. And some people don't. Well, probably I don't have a process in place to make sure that everybody in the organization is getting consistent feedback. Yeah. And in order to improve outcomes, the process needs to change. So let's talk more about outcomes and process. This is a framework that we use at DecisionWise to help us understand how do we get to the outcomes. And if we look at the outcome that we're looking for, in this case, if the outcome we're looking for is engagement, and we measure engagement across a whole spectrum of different levels of engagement. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that we want everybody in the organization, or as many people as possible, to be fully engaged. Well, how do we get that outcome? Well, you might rightly tell me that employees need to choose to be engaged.
Right.
So there's a choice that an employee makes that says, I'm going to like my job, I'm going to bring more of myself in to the work every day, and I'm going to enjoy this. There's a choice to be made, and that is true. How do we influence more employees to make that choice? Well, we try to make the best employee experience we possibly can. Remember, the engagement, the positive response to the employee experience. So we try to make that employee experience. We're working backwards, if you haven't noticed on this chart. We try to make the experience as best we can. And so sort of when we put all the things together that we've designed for our employee experience, we might be able to call that an invitation. Here's a great employee experience. We invite you to make the choice to engage.
Yeah.
So, but going into employee experience, we have to look at the process, or we might call it the culture. Right? The culture is just the way we do things around here. So the process that we put forward and that would come together and make the employee experience are going to be what's happening at the senior leadership level. What are the values that are being espoused? What are they showing? What's the strategy that they're rolling out? Organizational support, what's HR's role in this? What kind of tools and resources do I have? What kind of communication tools do we have? Do we have Teams in place or Zoom in place or something like that? We have organizational support to help us design a process that leads to a better employee experience. And then what happens at the manager and team level? What are the interactions like between managers and direct reports? All of those are things that would go into the process. And if the engagement is the what we want, then the process kind of determines how are we going to get there? How are we going to get there? And so we'll talk more about that as we get into this presentation. But one of the things that you might ask, if you're just kind of starting out in this process, or if you've been in this process of trying to improve engagement over time, I'm guessing a lot of people on this call are interested in improving engagement in the organization. One of the things you might ask yourself is, what is the organization ready for?
Yeah.
The organization that you're in, what are you ready for? So you start somewhere in this effort to adjust employee experience to improve engagement. You have to start somewhere. And most organizations are going to start, and I think it's the right place to start, by measuring outcomes. So if we look at this is what we call an engagement maturity model. And what we try to do is we try to say, okay, what are you ready for? And that helps us determine the plan for helping you improve engagement in your organization. So if you've just been passive engagement up until this point, so you've just never
measured it.
It just has happened to you.
Yeah.
Then we would say the first thing that you should do is determine what are all the outcomes that you want from your employee experience, and let's measure them in an engagement survey.
And this is a lot of steps I see HR people step into where they just got enough approval from the CEO to actually run the survey.
Right.
So, hey, we're just going to do a baseline this year. We just want to gather data, understand what's going on. And they're hoping to use the outcomes of the survey to gain more traction with the executive leadership team, and so on.
And I think I've seen people be very successful with that approach, right?
Yeah.
You say, let's start here. This is just a simple place to start. We're measuring outcomes, and we're trying to identify, are there pockets of dissatisfaction in the organization? Are there things that as an organization where we really struggle or where we're really doing well?
Yeah.
Really good to measure the outcomes first, take organizational action, identify 2 or 3 things that are 1 or 2 even things that are difficult in your organization and try to make progress on that. You can even do that at the department and team level if you want to. And then communicate both the results that we get from the survey and the actions we're going to take. That's where people sometimes, they communicate the results, but they don't communicate the actions, even if they take them.
Sure.
They don't communicate the actions. So that's, if we're moving from passive engagement and we're trying to think, what is the next thing that we do? Then that's going to be a really good place to start. And what happens, and if we go up this maturity continuum, what happens is that as you do that, what happens is automatically you start to engender commitment from your leadership team. Mm-hmm. They start saying, oh, this was useful information that we got from this. We were able to do something and we were able to make progress. And that's the best way to build commitment from your leadership team. And you need that because ultimately, and the goal for most organizations is to get up to that third step, what we call management. And really what that means is that we are driving engagement in the organization, not from HR, but through the leadership structure.
Yeah.
So we want to get to that point. We'll talk about getting to that point. But first, another word on this approach of just surveying. We understand the outcomes, we make an action plan, and that leads to greater engagement. We call that the measure-react approach. In other words, we survey to understand the areas of general concern by people in the organization. We act to address the concerns, and then we measure again to see if we've improved.
Pretty simple.
And we call this measure-react. It's a very reactive approach to engagement. But maybe if you've done that a few times, and most organizations have, and many people I think on this webinar have probably done this a number of times, and they're thinking, well, what can I do now?
It gets a little stale.
It gets a little stale, and pretty quickly, right, Charlie? How many can you do before you're like, well, we're kind of ready for more here?
Right, yeah.
2, 3 maybe of annual surveys where you're like, okay, we're ready for more. But most organizations, after they've done the first, are saying, hey, we found this very valuable. We were able to improve some things, and now we'd like to think of how can we do more. That's when we start stepping into a more proactive approach. So I mentioned a lot of organizations are looking for this holy grail of managing or driving engagement through the leadership structure. And what we need for that are these 3 things that you see in these boxes. Expand ownership of engagement. So now it's not an HR team or a small team in the HR department that is kind of leading all the engagement efforts in the organization. We've expanded it to senior leaders, and now we're expanding it to all managers so they own engagement. We need to build accountability for those managers, and I'm going to suggest we need a more process-based approach to improving engagement. We need to look more at the process. And when I say process, I'm including behaviors, I'm including practices, I'm including competencies of leaders, I'm including all those things, even the tools and everything that we have in order to support our efforts. That's what we're looking at when we're looking at the process. We're not just looking at the outcome and trying to come up with simple solutions to improve the outcome. We're looking at the process of what got us to that outcome. So, can we measure process through engagement surveys? Is a good question. We get that. That's something that a lot of what we measure on engagement surveys are outcomes. Can we measure process? Well, I would say to a certain extent we can. We have this section on the survey, for example, that's called My Supervisor. And the My Supervisor section has a number of questions that are kind of process items that lead to better engagement. We know when supervisors provide consistent feedback to their employees, those employees tend to be more engaged. So we have that. That's sort of a process thing. Now it says, hey, supervisors, setting an expectation in the survey, supervisors, you should be providing feedback. But it's not necessarily telling them how to provide the feedback. We're just saying that feedback is an important component of it. Likewise, we say supervisors also need to provide recognition for good contributions and the efforts that their team puts in. So we're saying that they need to do that, and that's an important part. So that's kind of a process item, right? That says, okay, part of the process of a supervisor engaging their team is to provide feedback and also to provide recognition. And also we want our supervisors to help the team develop and grow. And by the way, we also want supervisors to care about their employees as a person. So all of these come from our standard survey. They're all part of our engagement survey, and they're all kind of part of the process. But I would also suggest a lot of these are really important, and it's important, and we're kind of laying out the high-level process for engaging an employee if you're a manager or a supervisor, but we're also looking at this and saying, okay, what does it mean to give ongoing feedback? What does it mean to give to give recognition? What does it mean to support my employees' efforts to develop and grow? And what does it mean to care about people as a person?
Sure.
So they do a great job of identifying more specific outcomes that we want, or even we might call those kind of loose parts of the process that we're looking for in order to engage people. They do a really good job at describing what managers should be doing, but not necessarily how to do those things.
So they're more actionable, but still not describing exactly what to do.
Yeah, I think they're considerably more actionable for sure. I can tell from that, I really need to be giving my employees more feedback, but it's not going to tell me exactly how should I do that. So what we do in order to kind of close that gap is we try to establish process through competency models. So an effective leadership competency model will define competencies and behaviors associated with effective leadership. It will help define what is the process that I need to take. What are the actual behaviors that I need to exhibit in order to access the better outcomes, the engagement outcomes that we're looking for. So here's here's kind of how we view this. We design expectations for leaders. We say these are the behaviors that you should and the process that you should take. Mm-hmm. We communicate those expectations to leaders, and then we hold them accountable against those expectations. So here's a good example of how this works. So notice the difference. In our engagement survey, we say, my manager cares about me as a person. We could establish a leadership competency for our organization. If caring is really important, we say we need managers who care about their people.
Yeah.
If that's an outcome we're looking for, we believe that's going to drive engagement. Then we could say, look, here's what we mean by you care about your people. Now we're getting into more specific actions, right? So, and then leading into that competency, we have to define that competency, we have these behaviors. One is demonstrates a personal interest in the well-being of others. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Right, so that's an action that a manager can take that shows caring. I'm demonstrating a personal interest.
Yeah, it's observable.
Right, observable. Makes time for other people. All right, either I do or I don't. Right, so that's an observable behavior. Sympathizes with others meeting personal or professional challenges and provides help when others are overworked or stressed. So now we've gone further, and we could go further than that. We could add additional things here to say, really, to define caring, we need to define it with more. I'm just giving 4 examples of behaviors that might fit into this model. But what we're doing is we're saying, okay, if I'm going to show that I'm caring, then that I care about my team, that they feel cared for as a person, then these are the things that I need to do as a manager. It becomes very observable and very actionable. They're able to do that very easily. And you might say, well, how do we know that these are the behaviors that we need in order for people to feel cared for? Well, we still have to measure for outcomes. So we install a leadership competency model like this. We really define what does caring mean. And then on the next engagement survey, we see, do people feel more cared for by their managers? Mm-hmm. Right? So we still need to understand, are we getting the outcomes that we want? We still need to measure that way. So we like to establish accountability in these areas. We can do that using 360-degree feedback. You can put competencies and behaviors into an annual performance review, really define it well using bars or behavioral anchored rating scales to really say this is the exact behaviors that we're looking for, and this is a level 5 behavior and a 4 and a 3. You can do all that. You can do all of that in order to really define and set the expectation and hold these leaders accountable. I think it's a very useful way to say we're approaching employee experience at the kind of the base level of how a manager interacts with their employees, and we're really defining well for them how that should happen in our organization. And as I mentioned, we still need to verify if the process we put in place is getting the outcomes that we want. So we do that through the engagement survey. We still need to measure for outcomes. And so you might ask, okay, so we do an annual engagement survey. We put into place some changes in our process. Mm-hmm. So let's say we did the annual engagement survey in January. We changed the process up in February. Now we're going to wait again until January of the next year to see, was that process effective? So that's what typically we might say.
The annual process.
Right. But one of the most frequent pieces of feedback that we receive from organizations or people in organizations is you don't listen to us enough. Mm-hmm. And so we might ask the question, what's our actual listening strategy? Is our listening strategy that we kind of parachute in once a year and ask the questions? I think that's probably the way that you start. Mm-hmm. But if you've kind of been doing that for a while, you might be noticing, hey, we really want to see, we changed the process up after we did the annual survey. We really want to see, did that have a positive impact or did that have a negative impact? So we should make it easy for employees to provide feedback to the organization, and we can do that by inserting a continuous listening campaign. So as we mentioned before, the annual survey is we do that once a year. We measure for outcomes.
It's longer, more comprehensive.
It's like 50 questions, usually. It's longer, more comprehensive. We do that once a year. And I think that's still a good move. If you're measuring engagement, you really want to make sure you're getting the outcomes you're looking for. But if I've changed up the process, say in February, I may be thinking, well, did that change have a positive impact on the outcomes that we're looking for? And so I've worked with a lot of the organizations I work with or have worked with over time have put into place a pulse survey. One of the organizations I work with does 3 pulse surveys, and they make adjustments each time. And what they do is they say, here's the thing that we've decided to work on based on the annual survey, cast a wide net. Here's where all the energy went to these 2 or 3 things that we're working on. Yep. And then they do a pulse survey every 3 months to see where are we with this and make sure that when they get to the annual survey that they have the outcomes that they want in the annual survey, and they're just hoping they get to work on something different next time. So most organizations that don't pulse end up working on the same thing that they were going to work on. And then they wait a year and they're like, oh, okay, so we did some good things with the process, but we didn't fix it all the way. So I guess we're going to work on that again and do some more things on that same issue.
Made a little improvement, but we're still low.
Right. The benefit of a pulse survey is you can see, okay, we made some tweaks. Let's see, did it work? And then, all right, so we did another pulse. So if you do a quarterly pulse, you have a few opportunities to do that. Make a few more tweaks, pulse again. Make a few more tweaks and pulse again and see where we are with that. Most organizations don't do a quarterly pulse. They'll usually just do like a 6-month pulse or something like that. Or if you're on an every other year cadence, you might try to do a couple of pulses between the survey that you do every 2 years. So pulse survey is a good way to kind of shorten your iteration timeline. We can iterate on things a little bit more quickly. We don't have to pulse. We don't have to ask all the questions. We can ask 10 questions or 5 questions on a pulse survey, and we can get the information that we need to say, okay, we need to make another adjustment. All right. So in addition to that, in a really robust listening campaign, you can add all these other things. So ad hoc pulsing might be, well, we have one department. Our engineers really struggled in this area. So we're not going to send a pulse to the whole organization, but we might hit the engineers with 2 or 3 pulses throughout the year to see if we're making progress on this thing that they're upset about. We also might say, well, what we're noticing is that people disengage pretty quickly when they get here. We don't have a great onboarding process. Let's start measuring to make sure that the process is happening and that we're getting the right outcomes from our onboarding process by doing onboarding surveys. Or we might notice people are leaving after 3 years. Let's start running an exit survey to see what are the reasons that they're leaving the organization. Or we might just say we really want to have a more frequent monitoring program, and we can do anniversary surveys and send out a survey to everybody on their hire date every year and say, hey, thank you for being here for another year, and what are some of the things that you can tell us about your experience?
So every month, a 1/12 of the population. You're
assuming
getting data
your
from the 12th
hiring
every month.
Assuming your hiring is pretty even throughout the year, you get a pretty consistent look at your employee experience. Usually those are a little more general. The anniversary, maybe there's 2 or 3 questions and a promoter score, a net promoter score question, along with maybe an open-ended question at the end to see where things are. But it can give you a good measure for where people stand throughout the year. So all these things could be part of it. And undergirding all that would be 360-degree feedback that is more of a process survey. It's spelling out the behaviors you want from your leaders, or even your direct, or even your individual contributors. You can do something for your executive leaders, director level, VP. You can do something for line level leaders. And we're essentially sending that out to develop them and make sure that they are exhibiting the behaviors that we need in order to drive the culture through the leadership structure, drive engagement through the leadership structure. So all those things can be part of a listening campaign. Now, again, we're looking at the maturity model, and many of you who are currently in passive engagement right now are saying, well, I can't do all that right now.
Right.
I'm never going to get that approved. But I bet you can get an annual survey approved. So you start there. And then once you do that, then there may be more of a desire to say, well, maybe we want to know more quickly if the changes we've made have had an impact. So now we're looking at doing a pulse. And then from there, you're like, well, maybe we want to look at some of these other things, and so on and so forth, to really develop a listening strategy over time. We know these things don't happen overnight, and we know that it takes time to get the buy-in necessary in order to launch a really robust campaign like this. I guess the point of the matter is we want to make sure our employees feel like we're keeping a pretty constant pulse on what's going on in the organization. We want to make sure that they know that we're interested in the outcomes that our employee experience and our culture are creating for them.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk more about employee experience. And something that we actually have talked about in the book that we wrote, The Employee Experience, is these critical moments in the employee experience. So I want to talk about it a little bit right now, just kind of to close up the information that we're sharing today, because we showed you all these parts of a listening strategy. And when we look at employee experience, we know that that's the impact that the culture has on employees. But we also know employee experience can happen at planned intervals and unplanned intervals. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's these planned intervals or planned moments of the employee experience that we call Chronos Moments. That comes from a Greek word that I can't remember the exact definition.
Chronology.
Yeah, chronology, exactly. Yeah. Means, one thing happens after the next. And so in the time that an employee works for an organization, they'll have their hire date. How things go on the hire date is going to have an impact on how they view that organization going forward, the onboarding process, any training that they experience. We know that that's going to happen, and we know that we can give them that training and we can control that experience. They're going to have an anniversary every year that they're going to be stopping, and people just naturally reflect, I've been here for another year. How did it go? We've got performance reviews that we know happen on an annual basis. Hopefully they happen on an annual basis at least. We have promotions that happen. How does that go? And then we have the exit. There can be a lot more of these what we would call planned moments that happen within the employee experience. And so there are these things that we can look at and say, well, we know that this person has to go through training. I guess we could just let that happen. Or we could say, let's really take this opportunity. We know this person's going to be there, or this group of people are going to be there. We can plan this out and say, make this a really great experience. Mm-hmm. Same thing with the anniversary. Same thing with performance reviews. Let's see what we can do to plan to make these better experiences. And what we can do to make sure that those are going well is we can put into place these things that we call life cycle surveys. These events that happen at predictable points in time, we can follow up with people and get feedback on, hey, did we get what we really needed out of this experience, or do we need to tweak this in the future? We had training on a new system that we're implementing. How did that training go? And is this something that we need to do as we put people in the future through the same training? Is there something that we need to do in order to make that a better experience? Same thing with new hire, onboarding, anniversaries, exits, performance reviews, all those things we can gather feedback on and see, all right, are we getting the outcomes that we desire from the chronological moments in time that we know all employees are going to experience? Are we getting the right outcomes from those things? So it becomes very easy for us to, not easy, it's hard, but we still need to, it's a lot more easy to conceptualize the idea that, okay, we can plan out these experiences that we know all employees are going to have and make sure that they have a good experience during that time.
The other thing to think about, like, these are easier to implement than your annual survey. So that's a big deal. You got to get approval from everyone. You're getting results to everyone. These you kind of set up. It's kind of plug and play. And then you're getting data that you can use and leverage. And it's not going to the entire population. You're not trying to get manager reports out of these. So these are less impactful on the organization, but provide a lot more value to the HR team, for example, and others.
Yeah, and my favorite of all of these is onboarding, because you get the opportunity to see, did we provide this person with an opportunity? So what we do in onboardings is we say, we measure two things in onboarding surveys: enablement and engagement. Do they feel enabled? Are they ready to do the work that we've hired them to do after the onboarding process? That's an important thing. And then also, do they feel like they want to do the work that we've hired them to do after the onboarding process? So enabled and engaged to do the work that they're doing. So I love the onboarding survey because it gives us a good view into the first experiences that they have in this organization, were they positive or were they negative. I've worked with so many organizations that really don't have an onboarding plan.
And we do find the first-year employees are at higher risk to leave the organization. Usually when we're looking at like tenure groups and when they leave, the first-year group or after that first year, they tend to leave at a higher percentage than others in the organization.
And there's some organizations that have a hard time getting past the initial handshake. Hey, welcome. And people just do a U-turn. Yeah, I can't work here. We definitely see that. And I'm working with one organization in particular that prioritized onboarding surveys ahead of anything else because they had people that were leaving within the 6-week onboarding period. Yeah. They're just like, well, this isn't for me. And so they leave. And so they prioritize onboarding first. That's the first thing they wanted to see is, and we'll measure process for the onboarding process, make sure that's happening. But then are we getting the outcomes that we want from the onboarding process? And a lot of people, when you get the onboarding process right, you get people really engaged in that first year that they're there, but then maybe they'll fall off, and that's why anniversary surveys can be useful too. But it's really interesting to look at that onboarding process and really see, are we doing the right things in the onboarding process to make sure people feel engaged and enabled to do the work that we're asking them to do. So again, we can plan these things. This is parts of the employee experience that this should be low-hanging fruit. We can identify them ahead of time. We can plan for them ahead of time. If we fail to do that, then we're just letting whatever happens happen. And culture is sort of just happening to us. And then whatever employee experience emanates from that culture is just happened to us. And then our engagement outcomes are just happening to us, right? So that's where we go with it. So there's 2 different kinds of moments I mentioned, planned and unplanned. The unplanned moments we call the Kairos moments. And that's translated from Greek roughly. Kairos is roughly the right moment. The way we look at Kairos moments is that there are these moments of truth that happen in an employee's tenure with an organization that happen at unpredictable times. Yeah. But they reveal the underlying values of the organization when they happen. So they tend to be very revealing. And so it's like, I made a mistake. First time I make a mistake. How did my manager react? How did the team around me react? How did the organization react? Mm-hmm. How many phone calls did I get about that mistake, or emails, I guess, is Teams messages is what we would get these days, right, about that mistake. Right. Yeah. Customer complaint, or I've had a conflict in the workplace, or I have a lifestyle change, or I failed, or there's a riff that happened in a reduction in force that happens. How did I handle that layoff? Periods of time where we have heavier workload. What are we doing how do I feel supported in that time? And then I have personal issues. I have things that have happened, a sick child or something like that happens. And the way that the organization responds to those situations goes a long way to determining how I view my experience and how I'm willing to react to my experience going forward. If I have a major personal tragedy and the organization seems not to care about it, and says rub some dirt in it and get back in there, it may impact my ability to be ever engaged in that organization. Yeah. So these are extremely critical moments in the employee experience, and you can think of more. I'm just, we're just spitballing here with a few of them that we can think of, but you can think of more, and they happen at unpredictable times. But we also know that in your organization, they're happening on a daily basis. Somebody is having a personal crisis or a difficult day or have made a mistake. They're worried about their job. They're worried about something. And how we respond to those can have a really huge impact on whether or not people are willing to, engage in the long term. So how do we prepare for those moments? We know that we can't predict them. We can't plan ahead of time and say, okay, we know that Charles is going to have this really personal problem going forward. Let's plan for this, because Charles always has personal problems. We know that. We can plan for that ahead of time. We know it's going to happen. No, that's not how it works, right? So we have to, I'm going to go back to something we covered midway through this presentation. We have to make sure that we are describing for managers the behaviors and competencies that they need to develop, the processes that they need to go by, in order to prepare them with those, in order to respond to those Kairos moments or those critical unplanned moments in a way that drives engagement.
Yeah, and a lot of this, I think, comes back to culture as well, because you're looking at if someone makes a mistake, what is our attitude? Are we positive about that? It's a learning experience, or are we so focused on results that we can't afford mistakes, and mistakes are punished, so then people are afraid to take risk, And you're then detracting from a performance-oriented culture because people are afraid to really kind of stick their necks out on things.
And they might even be afraid to admit when they made a mistake. And so it just festers and festers and festers, and then all of a sudden you got a huge problem. But you're right, it all comes down to culture, and culture is the way we do things around here.
Yeah.
And that is the process, right?
Yeah, and it informs the competencies that we develop and what we hold managers accountable for, and then how they treat their employees.
So if we go back to the very beginning and say, all right, so the outcome we're looking for is engagement. And we know we get engagement through a really positive employee experience. And we know that employee experience emanates from the culture. You're right. The exact thing that we need to work on usually is the culture in order to get the outcome that we're looking for. And that can mean, and if we went back to the original chart that I showed, we're looking, how do we make sure that that's happening at the senior leadership level? Do we have the structures in place, the organizational support structures, in order to support the culture that we're looking for? And then we look, what's happening at the leader team level, the individual manager level, to make sure that that is being reinforced on a day-to-day basis in those interactions. So we prepare people for the right moments, and one of the ways that we can do that is through competencies, and then through using 360-degree feedback in order to help them develop those things that we're looking for, right? We're setting an expectation, as we mentioned before, and then we're following through and holding them accountable against those expectations that we're looking for from our managers at that base level. But these competencies should be shown and demonstrated and exemplified from the top leadership of the organization. We need our HR leaders to be exemplifying and showing others how to do these things. We need to provide training in order to make sure that our leaders have this ability to do it. We can't just say, this is what we expect, and not follow through with any support. All that support has to happen, and we need to show examples of that in order for the culture to really change, to create a better employee experience, which will eventually get us to the outcome that we're looking for, which is better engagement.
So one question that came in is around leadership team needing coaching and training in a lot of different areas. What do you recommend for a company with 20 years of business history to start with? So usually I say, look at your performance appraisal process and what you're measuring there. Is it all metrics based, or do you have some behavior topics that you're also looking at? So maybe there's 4 or 5 or 8 behavior or competencies that you're starting with to say, as a manager, we're trying to make you model these, and I, as your manager, will judge that. Yeah. The other piece is to create a 360 and measure it more comprehensively and get feedback from all different groups and start that as your point. But essentially, you're trying to say just what you described here. We have to describe what we want to hold managers accountable for that align with our culture, create good outcomes, all that good kind of stuff.
Right. And I would agree with that. I think the really big benefit of implementing 360 in your organization is kind of on the sly from the HR team. You can create a competency model, like you're measuring from a competency model on a 360. Yeah. Whether you're just adopting one that's already out there, you've kind of adopted one in your 360, and by extension, you're setting an expectation. Anything that's on your 360, people are gonna be like, "Oh, this is what I'm being measured against. This is what I need to do." All of a sudden,
they pay attention to it.
So now they wake up and they're like, "Oh, okay, I didn't know I was supposed to be doing that."
Yeah.
And so we've kind of communicated an expectation and immediately providing them with some accountability against that expectation. Now, 360s to start, I always believe should be development focused. So we're just saying, look, we're doing a 360. These are really good behaviors that we want you all to do. But this is for your own development. We're looking to develop you in that way. And when we do it that way, we can set up a process that's really a development-focused process. And so our senior leaders don't feel so taken aback by it. They're not like, oh, if you're doing this and sharing it with everybody, then that's doesn't feel like a development-focused 360. Sure. Yeah. But if you say, look, this report is for you. These are the expectations we have as an organization that we've kind of laid out in this competency model. This is a report for you. You can kind of work through this and decide what are the areas that you really feel like you need to improve. You can provide coaching to your leadership team, whether if you need an external coach, you can find an external coach, or if you have coaches internally, you can provide coaching to that leadership team to help them kind of do that. Now, if you have a really set of criteria that you're wanting to use in in developing your leaders, then you could also kind of try to create a training program. But usually that's harder to get across the finish line than 360-degree feedback. 360-degree feedback is a really great way to just sort of introduce, here are some competencies that we need, and to get people to start working on them.
Yeah, and it's kind of the first step as well. So, we're pretty biased because we conduct 360s, we run 360s. Yep. We've got, 80 different competencies, 320, I guess, behaviors aligned with those different ones that you can choose from. So there's a full library and an area of resource you can choose from to kind of build that if you'd like. But we always say that's your first entry point when you're trying to develop your leaders. And then they're really interested because it's relevant to them.
And there's a reason why we're biased in this, because we do 360s because we believe in them.
Yeah.
There's a reason. Yeah, the chicken or the egg here. But the first thing that came first was our knowledge that this is a really effective way to improve leaders. Okay, just a summary here. And I know there's at least another question that we'll try to get to before the end of this, but a summary of what we've talked about today. Remember, employee perceptions around communication really have improved over the last year. That may have happened in your organization. If it's happened in your organization, one of the things you might be thinking is, what have we done differently that we can preserve and do more of in the future?
Yep.
And what have we done differently that we can even do more? Like we can really take that to the next level. As you continue to measure outcomes through the measure react approach that we talked about, you may become ready. The organization you might be feeling that right now, that you're ready for a more proactive approach. But accessing better outcomes usually requires improving the process. We've talked about a few ways that you can look at process, measure process, and improve upon that process. We talked about leadership practices being critical in this. So we want to outline practices, processes, behaviors, competencies that are all critical parts of the employee experience. And then an effective listening strategy will help you keep a more frequent pulse on the organization. It will also help you to measure the outcomes you're getting from planned critical moments in the employee experience and also unplanned critical moments in the employee experience, those moments that really have a huge impact on whether or not people engage.
So a few questions here we want to address at the end. Our first one was around anniversary surveys. Are they just for new employees or legacy? Both. And so we're trying to get everyone, no matter when their anniversary happened in December, to take that survey if they started in December 5 years ago.
But it'll be the first year. You do it after the first year. Yeah, you're right. And then you do it over time. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Someone asked if we can share those competencies and behaviors. Yes, we can set you up with a free trial to our 360-degree feedback platform where you can get access to those and see those and build a sample survey if you'd like. Another question about kind of, we're an organization kind of in this measurement state of employee engagement. How long would it take a company to get on board? And actually, if you want to do a survey with DecisionWise, we say 6 to 8 weeks. And then what makes it easy? Well, if you have we always say, is your HRIS in good shape?
Yes.
Is your hierarchy good? Because then it's easy to just give us an employee list and we can run and start that. If not, there's a little bit of time. But it is very quick, and normally we say 6 to 8 weeks to start a survey and have results.
And we'll usually have a pretty good starting place of a survey that you can say, this is a pretty good template that you can use, and it's not that hard to adjust that to make it the right survey for you to use as well.
And then how do you ensure, I think anonymity is the question here, from, manager retaliation. So most times, and best practice in the industry is that 5 or more responses are required to see a breakout on the report. So we can provide team reports to manager groups that have 5 or more responses. Sometimes you don't do that, though. If you feel like your managers aren't ready to kind of get that, that detailed information, maybe you just keep it at the department level. Right. They can be broken down by team. You can provide really good detailed manager reports so they can work at the team level. And then the last question here from clients you've worked with, what happens to their engagement survey, their employee engagement when they've completed the annual survey, but their leadership doesn't take and make any changes over the next year?
Experience is that they only do it maybe 2 or 3 years, and then maybe they stop doing it. But it's really critical, if you're ready to measure, that you are also ready to take action on the things that you're doing. And it can be very small actions, but as long as you communicate it and they make an impact, then I think you're okay to kind of move on to the next phase.
Yeah, we see that very rarely, and most times they feel pretty committed to do something once they see the results.
That's right.
Well, great. Well, Dave, this has been great. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. Keep them coming. We can respond as well via email, so info@decisionwise.com. Thanks again, everyone, for attending. We look forward to having you join us on a future session. Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.